I'm Father Steve Grunow for the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm speaking today with Doug Ernst, who has created a fantastic graphic novel series called Soul Finder. Doug, I'm so pleased to talk to you today.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. The book itself kind of came out of my distaste for the modern comic book industry. A lot of heroes who used to stand for virtue no longer stand for that. The writers and the artists are, in many ways, they're activists that are masquerading as writers and artists. And for the most part, they insert political propaganda into the book that is essentially moral relativism is the message of the day. And I got sick of that after a certain amount of time, and I wanted to write something that actually tried to instill virtue into the audience.
Tell our audience a little bit about the characters in this series.
So we have Father Redder. Father Patrick Redder is a combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. He lost his leg below the knee in the war. His father was a cop and who died in the line of duty, but he was a good Catholic man. And so eventually Father Patrick Redder realized that there are physical wars that we fight, but really the spiritual battlefield is where it's at. And so he becomes a priest and also an exorcist. And in this particular world, this fictional world, there is a major order of exorcists, essentially, who take on evil that most people cannot fathom. And in order to be recruited for that, you essentially have to be a combat veteran. You have to seen combat up close and personal because you're taking on these physical challenges and the psychological challenges that most people, they really never would experience, including most priests.
Well, that's very interesting, and it's hitting a side of the priesthood that most people find fascinating and a little bit frightening. The idea of the priest as a kind of spiritual warrior. And what you've done in the stories is you've kind of externalized what really is a struggle within the soul of the priest, a struggle between good and evil in terms of their character, in terms of their conscience, in terms of their decisions. And you've taken that and you've externalized it and you've given it a particular locus of attention in the priest as exorcist. Why did you choose that particular take on the priesthood?
So initially, like I said, with Marvel Comics in particular, I've always been a Marvel guy. You have this situation where the heroes are no longer heroes. They don't even have anti-heroes. They kind of stand for nothing in many ways in the comic books. And I wanted a situation where I wanted to pit good up against evil. And initially I thought, okay, well, demons, you can't get any more evil than a demon. So now I want somebody to go up against these demons. And I was sick and tired of the way that priests were portrayed in comic books. And I was like, I want to have a priest, but a good priest. And I want to write it from a Catholic point of view. A lot of times the writers are not Catholic and they completely botch basic Catholic teaching. And so I was like, okay, I actually want a priest. And then on top of that, a lot of times they have exorcism tales, but it's not a priest. It's essentially somebody who's performing witchcraft on other sort of demonic beings, which would just exacerbate the problem in real life. So I was like, I actually want to have a Catholic priest go up against demons.
It's very interesting you talk about the kind of collapse of there being a clear sense of good and bad or good and evil in a lot of popular culture. And what you end up with are just antagonists and protagonists in which no moral judgment is made in terms of whether or not there's good or evil happening.
Right.
I think in inserting kind of into this comic book universe a living theological tradition that is saying, yes, there is good and evil. It resides within the human soul and it resides within the world. And that's where human beings find themselves all the time. It's really kind of a countercultural move that you're making. But it's also a more of a theological take on a comic book story. And that's also something that comes across in the way that you tell the tale. These are real priests. They're not kind of facsimiles. That they're actually ordained. They're given a mission by the church. They're acting on behalf of the church in this very special mission. So you've kind of created a theological universe as well as a fantasy universe, and you've brought the two of them together. What types of spiritual reading or theological research did you do to prepare yourself to create these stories?
Sure. So that was one of the issues is if I'm going to tell a story about priests and who are exorcists, I didn't want to get that wrong. I didn't want to get emails from priests after the fact saying, Doug, this is, you're a heretic, basically, or you're just getting this all wrong. And so I read quite a few books. In terms of just the basic theology, definitely was a fan of Thomas Merton, von Balthasar. So you could see why I like Bishop Barron and Word on Fire. These are books that definitely influenced my thought over the years. And then Father Ripperger is another one in terms of the exorcists that take place. He has books out. I've read those books in terms of deliverance prayers for the laity and others. Father Amorth has a number of books as well on exorcism. So I did research into that. And then randomly here or there, I was able to talk to some priests and other people that know a lot more than I do and show them the script and say, am I on the right track? Am I on the wrong track? Is something wrong here? Please let me know before it goes to print because I don't want to screw this up.
You know, I'm of the opinion, let's say, that exorcism is very dangerous business. And to even speak about exorcism is very delicate business. It's something serious, and that because human beings have a kind of fascination with the devil, you know, there's a kind of adage about preaching that, you know, you can preach about any number of topics and people will not listen, but the minute you mention the devil in a homily, everybody stands at attention or is focused their attention on you. So there's a kind of primordial fascination of people with evil, with the devil. They want to hear more about it, but it's not a good thing. It's inflaming our curiosity about such things. So as I said, it's dangerous business and it's delicate business. And that's apparent in the stories that you tell, that these priests, these fictional priests that you've created, they're men of action. They are, in a sense, action heroes, but they're involved in very dangerous activity. And also, in terms of the narrative and the way you construct the story, you're speaking very, very carefully about these things, evidently because you don't want to get them wrong. But I also think, Doug, you have an interior sense that to speak of these things is, in a sense, to risk awakening them. So you want to keep them embedded in an action story. You don't want to embed them into the reality of people's lives. So that's that's a challenge for you as a writer.
Right. So I didn't want to glorify the occult in any sort of way. I didn't want people to read the book and then start thinking that that was actually a cool thing. Like I said, you might find that in modern comics. I wanted them to know, like you said, this is a dangerous business, and there was a broader point to be made about, in the first book, Soul Finder Demons Match, why do bad things happen to good people? That's what I wanted to concentrate on. And then in the second book, Black Tide, I wanted to talk about hopelessness, despair, depression, anxiety, and the power of prayer in order to be able to lift people out of the muck and the darkness. Sometimes the only option is the spiritual option. It's prayer that could lift you out of the quote unquote abyss, which is in the second book.
Yeah, it's very well done in that respect, both in the first story and the second story. That prayer has power, but the power that's manifested in prayer is not, at least the prayer of the priest, it's not shamanistic power, as if through an act of their own willfulness, as an act of their own kind of personal power, they're able to cast out demons. But what you have going on in there is prayer of petition and invocation, in which your exorcist priests are calling upon a power greater than themselves that is necessary in order to engage the spiritual battle, lest they be defeated. So that's also an important truth as people kind of try to understand the role of a priest as a spiritual warrior or as an exorcist. It's not that the priest acting as a shaman or in the manner that many in a comic book universe, you just have a battle of one will against another will, and one will triumph, the one that's stronger. So that's kind of a
Correct.
more Nietzschean construal of the thing. But what you have going on in there is they're calling upon the power of Christ, or they're calling upon the intercessory power of the saints, so that that power might act on behalf of people who are oppressed by these evil forces. And that's really the right move in terms of a story about exorcists, but it's also the right approach for a Christian to understand the church's ministry in that regard.
Yeah, there was somebody who wrote me and they said that they enjoyed the book, but they found themselves thinking, okay, why is it okay? Green Lantern has a ring and his willpower, like you said, can overcome the willpower of the bad guy. And how come I'm okay with that? But then in this story, something is a little weird to me for some reason. I enjoy it, but I'm not sure. And I'm like, well, the priest doesn't have superpowers. He's calling upon Christ, as you said. And so ultimately, all of the power that he has the authority through the church to perform an exorcism, but the power always comes through Christ. And so that was very important. Like, I don't want people to think he has special powers, but if you're going to have a story where you essentially are relying on God, it's very important to have other forms of heroism, physical acts of heroism, psychological mettle in the priests. So there's a whole slew of obstacles that they have to get through just in order to get to the point where they could actually perform the exorcism or say the prayers. So that way, people that are not Catholic or they're not religious, they can appreciate all of the forms of heroism that took place up until that point where, spoiler, the priest is using a rosary and he's speaking to Our Lady, and then again, I don't want to spoil the entire thing, but the good guys essentially save the day.
Yeah, it's a good move that you make there, because oftentimes you'll hear in popular Catholic culture the idea of the rosary as a weapon. But in kind of the speech that's used, it's almost like, well, how is this a weapon? Do I throw it at the devil? You know, as if it's the physical object itself is something that you're just using to tie something up or something like that. When it's like, no, it's the interiority of the rosary prayer in your encounter with the sacred mysteries that affects a change in you and opens you up to a greater transcendent purpose. And so the manner in which you're portraying the rosary, or the power of the rosary in this book, is that it's an appeal. It's an appeal to that prayer as having a significance and power. And that's a significance and power that Christ himself has invested in the prayer. So that's a good move in the story. And again, it kind of serves to correct this idea that how is it that the rosary is a weapon? Another thing that's great about your characters is that they have weaknesses, and they are real weaknesses. And you've actually embodied that weakness in Father Retter's own physicality, in that he was injured. And that injury has had a significant impact on his life. So what can you say about these priests who aren't superpowered, and they're also profoundly human? That seems to be an intentional choice on your part. How did you come about making it?
So one of the things that I like about comic books in general, I've always liked characters where they could actually be hurt. Or you have someone like a Batman. He doesn't have he's not Superman, obviously. He doesn't come from another planet. He can be injured. You could break his back. Bane could actually break his back in an issue. And so that always helps add to the dramatic element of it, of course. But also in real life, people go through all of these obstacles day to day. They have their own tribulations that they have to go through, and maybe they are injured physically, or they have psychological scars from whatever in the past. But ultimately, you have the ability to overcome your own sort of constraints, whether it's physical or mental, and obviously turning towards the spiritual help aids in that exponentially.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Let's talk about Jesus, because Jesus is a presence in these comics, if not explicitly, implicitly. It's his power that's acting to effect good in the world through the actions of these priests. Jesus himself can be termed as an exorcist. The gospel begins with a stark confrontation between the Lord Jesus and the devil himself. Jesus is confronted time and time again by evil manifesting itself in what the Gospels describe as possession, or people that are oppressed by the power of malevolent spirits. It's a reality in the Gospels that's taken for granted. Now, we can kind of try to adjust our understanding about that to say that there's pre-modern understandings of physical maladies, that they didn't have the understanding that we have of diseases. But nevertheless, what the testimony of the gospel wants us to understand is Jesus is taking on dark spiritual powers that oppress human beings and even possess them. You have that magnificent story in Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel of the Gerasene demoniac, which is really a tale of terror enmeshed in the gospel itself. It's similar in a way to what you're doing. You have somebody who is just under the absolute oppression of evil spirits, and you have that dramatic kind of reveal of the name of them, that they are legion, for they are many. In your books, you kind of give the dark powers, the demons, a kind of physical form. In this one, they take the form of the creatures of the sea. In the previous story, they also have a physical form. So is that like a narrative device you're using to show forth a spiritual reality?
So yes, there's one demon in this particular book that takes the form of an anglerfish. And the anglerfish is this deep sea creature. And in the book, the abyss essentially, this is a metaphor for hopelessness, despair, anxiety, depression. Again, in the abyss, you have this demon, and the lure is basically the temptation to sin. It looks nice, it could attract you, it distracts you, but ultimately, when the priest is distracted by a moment, by this vision of his mother, I guess I will spoil that part, it distracts him just long enough for the demon to clasp its jaws around him. And so I was thinking that in many ways is a good way to liken sin. It's this lure, but it's very deceptive, and it catches your attention, and then if you give into it, then the demon is going to crunch your gut like it does to the priest in this particular scene. So there's always some sort of underlying element that I'm trying to get across, some sort of message, even if the demon has to take a form of an anglerfish or a deep sea squid, as it is in this particular book.
Yeah, you use the deep, the abyss, metaphorically here, and as you said, it's signifying something significant. You used other themes in your previous book to show things of great spiritual significance. So, in many ways, you're on the level of metaphor, and the comic book genre or medium, it lends itself to metaphor. So do you find that to be true? Do you find that to be a route of access by which you can present to people in a perhaps a more simple, parabolic way, a deeper spiritual truth?
Right. So one of the challenges with this sort of book is I don't want people to feel like I'm preaching to them or telling them what to believe. And so I'm trying to write it on a level where if they're not religious, they'll just like the idea of a giant deep sea squid tangling up a priest, and he's battling with it before he could get back to the surface. But if they do a little digging, if they think about what it is, if they even look at the text, at one point in time, the demon says, in the end, you will know that only hate is credible, which is my take on von Balthasar's love alone is credible. Mm-hmm. And so wherever people want to, however deep they want to dive into the book and what I'm saying, or if they even want to Google things about exorcisms or demons, I'm hoping that they will then see like, okay, yes, He actually did his research. This is theologically sound. And it's just more like me offering an entryway into the church. If they want to step through the doorway, they can. But if they don't, that's ultimately, they could just decide, okay, I just wanted a fun action adventure tale, and it'll stop there. But hopefully they're drawn, even if by a few degrees, closer to the church and to the good and to the true and to the beautiful.
Yeah, I like the idea of a route of access, because it's like taking somebody who's a non-believer and just taking them into the church and say, well, let's just look at the windows. Let's just come to some appreciation of these windows. Look at the shapes and the forms and the story that's being told. And there isn't this kind of a proselytation or proselytizing pressure on the individual. It's like, well, let's just take a look. Let's take a look here. And then the Lord's going to act to draw them in deeper, or he will prompt in their heart questions for themselves, right, and things like that. So that's a good move on your part. And what really interests me about it is you chose a particular form of popular culture to act as an evangelical lure to others, or as a technique of evangelization. Why'd you do that?
It's one of these things. I grew up, I loved pop culture, I loved Hollywood, I loved movies. I wasn't always the best Catholic in the world. I'm still not. Obviously, I'm a very flawed man. But as I grew older and I was seeing that these messages about virtue and heroism were essentially disappearing from tales. I grew up with, in the 80s, a lot of the comic book tales, maybe they were a little darker, but at the end of the day, they had a very good message. I grew up with the Steven Spielberg, Indiana Jones movies. Again, they could get a little dark at times, but ultimately they had good messages embedded in them. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm not, whether it's the movies or television or comic books, I'm not seeing what I want to see, what I feel like a generation of children needs in order to actually have a functioning civil society. And so how can I do my part? There's in Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain, he mentions that at one point in time, he only tried to write up to the level of his own ego in his own sort of self-deception and that sort of thing. And I felt for a long time like, I think that's me. I think I'm just writing to the level of my own ego as a critic. I want to actually do something. So when I stand before God and God's like, I gave you this vocation, I gave you these talents as a writer, what did you do with it? Other than just show that you're a witty guy, I would be able to say, you know what? I actually tried my best to impart good values to society and bring people to the church, but not in an overly aggressive or strange way.
Yeah, the thing is that oftentimes there can be a prejudice that evangelization of the culture should just immediately go to the high level. So we're in the university faculty lounge, or we have to create art that is at the highest level, and we should. Music too, we should. But the thing is that there are degrees of participation in culture. And if you just move everything to the highest level and there's no other points of mediation, you're going to lose a large number of people. So it's best that the church have this more elastic, organic strategy that's able to move at different levels of culture. So what you're doing is not at the level of critical studies of Homer's Odyssey. But you know what? There's a lot of themes that would resonate in a critical study of Homer's Odyssey in your books. The idea of the hero, the idea of the quest, the idea of the agon, the struggle, the suffering that the hero must endure. It's all there, but it's kind of translated at a level that the popular culture can accept and appreciate. So it's a great evangelical move, and it's a move that the church, I believe, has to make more and more and more. We can't just be cultural observers. We have to be cultural creators. And what you're demonstrating is, I guess as a writer, I can report the news. I can write columns of criticism and complaint about what's going on in the culture, and those things can serve some purpose. But I can also build and create. I can build a story. I can build relationships through art. I can create a story that can have a broader popular cultural resonance that communicates these spiritual and theological themes. So it's a very interesting kind of evangelization move that you're making, and I just want to commend you for it.
No, I appreciate that. And it's one of those things where, like you said, I could write a story, a news story, I could write a blog post criticizing a movie, but it's something like, how do you do something where it's like a Tolkien, without comparing myself to a Tolkien, but how do you do something where generations go by and people are still opening it up, they're still sharing it with their children, they're still analyzing it on a deep level, and they're still attracted to it in a way where it's like, no, this actually is something that is very meaningful to the culture. And so my goal was just to write, okay, well, I might not be the best writer in the world, but I'm going to give it the old college try, give it 110% to tell something where 10 years from now or 15 years from now, somebody might offer it to their son or daughter and say, hey, read this. I think that you'll find this a good book, and you'll actually learn a thing or two about the Catholic Church that maybe me just talking to you won't be able to get it across.
Yeah, that's really great, Doug. Now I'm going to do something right now. We're gonna turn the tables here. I've been asking you a lot of questions, and now you're going to start asking me a lot of questions because here's the deal. I think that comic books are so perennially popular because they deal in archetypes. Well, the archetype is now in the flesh, at least virtually in front of you. So you write about priests and stories. You got a priest right in front of you. You ask me some questions.
Well, one thing that I want to examine with the next book, and so I'm using you as research right now, is I wanted to explore a little bit the idea of a priest offers healing and consoles people that are actually having a tough time. They're dealing with the death of a loved one or whatnot. And so I wanted to know about who consoles the priest. Who does the priest lean on when the priest actually is going through tough times? Is it just other priests? I feel like there needs to be somebody. So Father Redder in the next story, he's dealing with a situation that is very painful to him. And I wanted to explore and say, well, who does he turn to when he's the one who needs comforting?
Well, in all of the Christian spiritual life, there's a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. So we are living through the sign of the cross in our entire spiritual life. So, and on the horizontal dimension of a priest's life, priests come from families, so they have you hope, the support of their families. Priests also have friends. They have friends in the presbyterate, and they have friends outside of the presbyterate who help them in times of trouble or when they have needs, but just on the level of friendship. The other thing is that priests are always considered in a relational way. They're in a relational way to the church, they're in a relational way to Christ, they're in a relational way to their bishop, and they're in a relational way with the other priests of the diocese. So there is a network of support for the priest on the horizontal level. Will an individual priest choose to take that? Will the people in those relationships choose to respond? That's kind of the great challenge, or where the confrontation of good and evil happens in all of our lives on the horizontal level. When there is a need, do we respond or not? Do we see in the need of another person Christ's own call for us to act? That's the horizontal dimension. Now the vertical dimension, and this is where it gets a little bit tougher. The priest configures their life to Christ. Their life is meant to be configured to Christ. Christ had the companionship of his friends, of his family. The gospel gives testimony to that. But there were moments when Christ was alone, and he experienced for himself all the loneliness that's inherent in the human condition. And even in his in his public ministry, you can see at times that despite the fact he's surrounded by lots of people, he's alone. And that was a spiritual experience that was necessary for him to endure so that he could unite himself to us in all things, which includes the experience of loneliness. So inasmuch as a priest agrees to conform their life to Christ, they are accepting for themselves that they too must pass through that crucible that Christ passed through. And one of the aspects of that crucible is learning to be alone and learning to see the sufferings of being alone as redemptive and opening up spiritual possibilities of introspection for self-understanding and also service to others. Because there's this great line of St. John of the Cross where he says, basically, if you're in a situation where there is no love, put love, and there you will find love. And that's really the great spiritual challenge of any loneliness that we face. It's like, I feel alone. I feel alone. Yes, you do, and the feeling is real. But perhaps an act of love, an act of generosity and kindness could break the prison of that loneliness and actually transform it into something redemptive. So that's my take. You got a horizontal level, you got a vertical level. The two of them come together are the shape of the cross. That's the cruciform shape of all of Christian existence, and that's where we find the priest.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because when I look at my local priests and over time, it seems like more and more and more and more responsibilities are being shoved onto the priest's shoulder. Like he's wearing multiple hats. Like he always wore multiple hats, but now it's like an entire hat rack going on. And I just felt myself saying like, okay, I want to do a story where it's like, okay, these guys are bombarded 24 hours a day with the needs of the people. When do they have time for themselves? And it's like, you don't want to be selfish, but at the same time, you do need a little bit of time to sort of detach from everything. And that was one of my concerns about, okay, well, when do these priests have time to sort of decompress a little bit?
Yeah, there's the decompression aspect, and priests have to be able to take care of themselves. They have to make very prudential decisions about the practical nature of their lives in terms of their intellectual development, their moral development, their physical development. You have to be very, very intentional about those things because if you're not on point for those things, you're not going to be on point for your mission. There's that aspect to it. But also, priests have to have time to cultivate a relationship with God. That's why they're there. And so that priests are not just meant to be the manager of other people's ministries or the chief executive officer of corporation parish. They're not like the finance, they're not meant to be the finance director of the physical infrastructure of the parish. They have to have oversight of those things because what they're doing is they're trying to keep everyone on point for what the mission of the church is. But if that becomes so consuming to them, their relationship with God can be compromised because we show forth what we love in our commitment of time. And so priests have to have time in the course of a day to be alone, not with themselves, but to be present to the Lord himself. And what is a priest doing at that time? He's praying. For the most part, praying for others, praying for his community. Now, if we Catholics and Christians take prayer seriously, we're believing that prayer is efficacious. And that means that it has to happen. It's a necessity. And so if a priest is being so hemmed in by temporal, communal, external expectations that he doesn't have time to pray, the priest is in spiritual danger, but the church itself is in spiritual danger.
Yeah, no, that's going to help me quite a bit on the third volume for sure. So one other question that I do have for you actually revolves around pop culture and how you deal with it. So when I used to come from a think tank world. I worked for the Heritage Foundation and dealt with a lot of nonprofits. There were a lot of social conservatives that didn't want anything to do with Hollywood. You had your WandaVision, World of Witchcraft video recently. There were a number of social conservatives in that realm where they didn't want anything to do with it. They thought that was a waste of time. and they thought it was ridiculous. But then they simultaneously would always complain that the culture was drifting away from them. So within your world and your sphere, how do you deal with uh, other priests that maybe are just like, why is this guy doing the Marvel Universe review here? I know Bishop Barron was way ahead of the curve with his movie reviews years ago, but there is a population of people that just don't see the value in it. And so how do you navigate that? For me, it's hard to not, I don't want to come across as a jerk when I'm trying to deal with these people. So how do you as a priest handle those conversations?
Well, one thing is the wisdom of really the spiritual grandfather of Word on Fire, Cardinal George. And he had a principle that he articulated very clearly. You can't evangelize what you don't love, or you won't evangelize what you don't love. So it's like the purpose of the church is to evangelize. That's one of the primary purposes of the church. The church is here to worship God, to evangelize, and to take care of the poor. That's why the church is here. Now, if you decide that you're going to hold an aspect of culture in such disdain that you're just going to say, I'm out, I'm not going to go there, there's people in that aspect of the culture that you will never encounter and you will never be able to speak to. So you can take kind of a rarefied approach and say, so that I will not be contaminated by this reality, I'm going to stay away from it. And maybe that's the right spiritual decision. But in terms of the culture, the more we pull out of the culture, well, look what happens to it. So if we're not creating the comic books, the novels, the movies, go on with it. The art, if we're not writing the novels, we're not doing any of these types of things, well, somebody else is going to do it. And when they're not going to tell our story, and when they do, they're going to tell it wrong. And then when that happens, we're going to be there with the criticism and the complaints about it. But the judgment is really falling on us because we were unwilling to enter into that arena of the culture and actually build something or create something. There was no reason that there could not have been a devout Christian or a devout Catholic writer involved in the creation of WandaVision. Maybe there were, I don't know. But the thing is that if offered that possibility, if a devout Catholic or a devout Christian said, no, I don't want to be contaminated by that thing, well, guess what? You've kind of lost your position to be complaining.
Right.
Now, there's also this other kind of dynamic that I understand is that at certain moments in the life of any culture, the church will, at least in some respects, retreat in order to regroup. But when it does that, it's not an end in itself. And that's the kind of dark temptation that can happen when the church kind of says, okay, we got to regroup here. That people get kind of satisfied living behind the confines of that wall. And they're like, wow, things are going well in here. We can just stay in here all the time. But it's a fool's errand because ultimately that kind of self-destructs. And the other thing is you can only derive strength from narrowness for so long. And then you become debilitated and weak. So that at the moment the culture really, really wants to go at you, they're going to wait until you're so weak that you can't resist anymore. And that's the problem of retreating and withdrawing as an end in itself. The other issue, and it's a real one, and I recognize this, it's going into dangerous territory. If you go into the culture, it has a certain glamour to it. Mm-hmm. And it has a certain allure to it. And you can become captivated by it. And you can, suddenly, you're there not doing what you're supposed to be doing, but you're doing something else. Right. Suddenly, you've become assimilated into that culture. You've lost your unique identity. You're not acting through your baptismal promises or identity. And then that's problematic. But look at your characters you develop. they have to go out into dangerous places. Uh, and it's a great truth of the Christian life and of Christian discipleship. There's no safe spaces for the Christian. Even the space of the monastery is a space of spiritual battle and conflict. We're riven inside ourselves all the time. The battles that you describe in your stories are going on in the interiority of every Christian. And so the thing is, there's no safe spaces. And the only way you can kind of negotiate the reality of a fallen world is you have to be ready to face down what is opposed to God in yourself and in others. You have to engage the dark powers at some level, and you have to prepare yourself to do so. If you're going to flee from that, what good are you for mission? And I know that sounds harsh, but we've got to be prepared to do better than just run away.
Now, here's another question for you. After having read both Demon's Match and Black Tide, so Black Tide, for instance, it centers around a miraculous Eucharist. There's an incorruptible priest who is at the bottom of the ocean in this shipwreck. And it obviously deals with possession and demons. Is there some element of the Catholic Church that you find is creative, fertile ground that nobody has actually tried to till recently? Something where you're like, I want to see that in either a Hollywood movie or a television show or even a comic book. Just the Catholic Church has so much rich history to it that I feel like even though I'm trying my best to sort of like bring some of this stuff up to the surface, you would have an inside take on something that demands to be seen from a writer or an artist.
Yeah, there's so much heroism in the Catholic faith. There's just a treasury of the weird and the wonderful. It's hard to know where to begin. You know, for example, could anyone ever make a cinematic kind of telling of Seven Storey Mountain? You've brought up Thomas Merton. Could anyone conceive that actually might lend itself to film? Or one thing that I thought that somebody could really do well is not just a documentary on Flannery O'Connor, but an actual film, a narrative telling of her life. I mean, she's an American kind of cultural master, and she was embedded in the American kind of experience in an extraordinary way. She suffered a great deal. She has a very interesting life. Why isn't that a movie? So those are two kind of examples of people from more recent history. But you really can't look into the history of the church and not find something that's a tale worth telling. So, again, you flummoxed me with your question because there's such a treasury of riches in regards to content. There's just so much. And I think that you've discovered that in your writing, that hey, there's this. Why don't we? Hey, there's this odd kind of thing about incorruptibles. I'm going to insert that into the story as something that's interesting and that can kind of like provoke a lot of questions in people. So I think that's there's such a treasury of riches. I just don't know where to begin.
Yeah, no, I've actually received some emails, and there's always somebody that will Google, be like, what is it, incorruptible? And then they'll Google it and they're like, that's interesting. And then they go down that rabbit hole of learning about something that for whatever reason, it's not taught in schools, it's not on television, it's not in movies, but it's there and it's just waiting for people to come across it and appreciate it.
Yeah. Any other questions for me, Doug?
I guess the last question I would have would be to circle back on the Masters of Social Media video that you recently did. So as somebody who works for a newspaper, I'm on social media all the time, and I've said before to you that I struggle with this. How do you actually deal with people on social media when so much of it is they're so antagonistic, and it feels like actually having a meaningful, truthful conversation with someone is difficult? you do a very good job with that, both here on YouTube and Twitter, but how can I be a better ambassador for the faith on social media?
Never forget that behind the virtual avatar is an actual human being. And that human being is not the avatar. And you don't know the pain points, the pressure points in that person's life that is provoking them to use social media in an antagonistic way. Now, in certain cases, you just can't engage with the person because it's an impersonal form, and to engage it is making the person worse. And so you have to walk away kind of sadly because there can't be the personal encounter that might be able to facilitate better understanding. So I guess, Doug, what I'm saying, you have to recognize the limits of social media as a tool of communication and also of interpersonal interaction. And that's because that we create a virtual sense of ourselves and the other person in social media, and that's not always what's true, and there's a lot hidden behind it. My impression from, the study of social media and using it for many years is that there are a lot of people on social media who are very much alone. And they might be embedded in social situations. They might, in their own real life, appear to be gregarious, but there's a deep-set loneliness inside of them. And that loneliness manifests itself in anger and rancor in social media. And they're acting out, as I said, some pain in their life. And that this becomes an outlet for them, and it's free of the type of response that they might receive if it was an actual interpersonal encounter. And so that would be my advice. Remember that there is a flesh and blood human being with a personal history behind every internet avatar.
It's good advice. And like I said, I struggle with that all the time. And anytime you're doing news stories, you're getting feedback, or even if you're writing books with Catholic teaching embedded in it, you're going to get some negative feedback. And that's just always a challenge for me, is how to appropriately respond to the negative feedback.
Well, Doug, this has been a great conversation, and I can't wait to speak to you about your third volume in this series. I'm really looking forward to it. Can you tell the audience where they can actually get Soul Finder?
Sure. So Soul Finder right now is available at iconiccomics.com. They have both this cover that you showed, and then there's also another one with Father Redder and Father Crane on there. The Demons Match, the first book, is available as well. And then every once in a while on Rugged Rosaries, they actually created the rosaries for this particular book. They have a limited number that they get in from time to time. I try and ship them to Rugged Rosaries. They could sell them for whatever they want. I'm happy to give them free books because they made my rosaries for me. So either Rugged Rosaries when they have them, or iconiccomics.com.
Oh, and before we go, I almost forgot about something. There's like a new character at the end of this current one, and I was reading through it, and he looks somewhat familiar to me. I don't want to tease it too much, but seems like you had some inspiration.
Yes, there is a Navy SEAL, and he might have a similar last name. He might share he might be a relative of yours, we'll say. And he shows up at the end, and he actually does show up in volume 3 as well. So that's a little bit of a teaser for the third volume. So he is there.
Well, I'm deeply honored, and I got to tell you that as a young man and a kid who grew up with comic books, there was always that idea that maybe you'll make it into the pages someday. So Doug, thank you for that.
No, I appreciate all your help, and even with the research. The third one, you mentioned the ascent of Mount Carmel and St. John of the Cross, and that actually is going to influence the story quite a bit. So thank you for that suggestion.
Wonderful. Doug, again, thank you. You're great, and what you're doing for the church and for the culture is just remarkable. Thank you so much, and pray for me, and I'm going to pray for you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thanks for watching. I'm Father Steve Grunow for the Word on Fire Institute.